Thank you so much, Jack, for inviting me. So my presentation kind of asks a central question. Is misophonia a sound processing disorder, or there is something more to it? Now, if you look, if you hear the word misophonia, misophonia literally means hatred of sounds. And once you have that word, then it kind of evokes the following picture of misophonia. So you have a sound, a trigger sound. That trigger sound is then processed in the brain. And then it activates some like emotion processing part of the brain. And then that triggers the distress and the reaction that follows. So since the sound is kind of the focus of this model, I call this model as a sound-centric model because it plays emphasis on the sound. Now, I see at least there are 3 problems of this sound-centric model. So one of the problem is that the source of the sound, that is where the sound is coming from or who is producing the sound, that does not get any due consideration in this model. Now, I work in brain imaging. And so when we look at, for example, what brain areas are activated by when people with misophonia are listening to trigger sound. So based on the sound-centric model, you might predict that, okay, sound processing parts of the brain would be active and then the emotion part of the brain would be active. But we see areas which goes beyond those areas. So for example, we see some of the areas which are more action-related or motor related. So the areas which are involved when you are trying to execute some action, those areas are also included in the activation network. And they are excited specifically by the trigger sound. So just by listening to the trigger sound, your motor system or the action system is also activated by the trigger sounds. And then the third problem that I see is that there are some behavioral and experiential responses to the trigger sound. Some of the behavioral, like experiential responses, when you ask people with misophonia, what is your experience of like listening to a trigger sound? They would describe the sound as, the sounds are like penetrating into my body. The sounds are penetrating into my personal space. And so it's not like a simple sound listening experience that you would typically attribute to sounds, but it's much more than that. And then there are some like behavioral responses as well, like mimicry. I will show you some of the data later on, that there's also mimicry persisting. So all these behavioral and experiential responses, it would be very difficult to explain in the sound-centric framework. Now, first question is, why is the source should be important? Why should we consider the source of the sound as well along with the sound? So one of the things is that the source basically sets the context within which the sound is perceived. So you can perceive the same sound and you can have a very different reaction to that sound depending upon the context in which the sound is generated. So when you have a knowledge of the source, okay, where the sound is coming from or what is the source of the sound, that sets the context, and that context then basically makes the sound perceived as, aversive or not aversive. And there are like numerous examples you can pick up. So for example, the sound of chalk on chalkboard, which is kind of like a universally aversive. A lot of people have, perceive this sound to be very, very aversive. But along with the sound, if you also have a visual cue, and that visual cue makes you believe that the sound that you are hearing is not the sound of the chalk on the chalkboard, but sound of somebody like playing a flute. Maybe not be good flute, but maybe bad flute, but it's somebody flute playing. And then and you ask people to rate the sound, and you find that they don't perceive that sound to be that aversive. So it's not the aversiveness was not maybe more in the sound per se, but how the sound was interpreted within a given context. And I think everybody in misophonia, we know that the distress or the reaction to the sound, to the trigger sound, is not an absolute one. It always depends on how those sounds are kind of interpreted and made sense of. That kind of determines within the misophonia context also. Now, if you look at in misophonia specifically, the sound that kind of causes a triggering reaction is mostly another person. Typically, because a lot of sounds are eating, breathing, chewing sound, so you can see that the source of the sound is kind of like another person, and more specifically, it is the action of the another person that kind of generates the sound. Sound is just a byproduct of those actions. So action is first, and then it generates the sound. And for example, for the eating and eating, breathing, and chewing sound, for example, you will have like orofacial movement or your mouth movement. You can call that as a action that generates the sound. So there's an action before the sound that comes on. And you can say that, for example, if the context in misophonia, you can say it's a social one, rather than just a simple sound driving the reaction, but there's a social context that underlies the reaction. And we know, for example, we do brain imaging, and and we try to find out basically how the brain processes a social information, like any stimuli from other people, for example, in the world, in the social world, compared to non-person or non-social stimuli, and brain treats them completely different. So there are, we know, specialized brain areas which are processing social information. For example, your face, your voice, for example, those are specifically specialized for processing that related information. So therefore, if you really want to understand what is the brain mechanism behind misophonia, just simply by looking at the brain responsive, but not looking at, okay, what the source was and what the social context was, it will be difficult to pinpoint what could be the role of different brain areas and what they could be involved in. So this is the data slide from my 2021 paper, where we showed, for example, when people with misophonia are listening to trigger sound, their motor area, for example, this is the motor area that I have pointed here in the brain here, it is specifically activated, more activated compared to controls when they are just simply listening to trigger sound. They're not reacting, they're not moving away, or they're not doing anything, but they're you get a strong activation to the motor cortex, which correlates with how much distress they feel in this one. Now, as I said previously, it would be very hard to explain why motor system should be so heavily involved in it. And we try to make sense of it in that paper, actually, why motor system was activated. So one is that if we kind of try, you can make sense of the motor area once you go back to that the source of the sound was action. So it is the perception of the action of the other person rather than the sound per se that is activating the motor area. And it is very well known in the social perception and cognition and in the motor world. When you see somebody doing some action, or when you hear the sound of somebody doing an action, your motor area is automatically activated by that is the sight or by the sound itself. So the motor system is activated when you consider not the sound per se, but the action behind the sound that can help you make more sense of why motor system is activated. So you can't understand within the sound framework, but when you go to the source or the action behind that, you can make sense of the data. The other thing which is related to motor system is the phenomena of mimicry in misophonia. So mimicry is basically repetition of the action of the trigger person, or kind of trying to reproduce the sound in response to trigger sound. So some people start doing that action or just produce that sound. So far, actually, the evidence for mimicry in misophonia has been very anecdotal. So we kind of collect, in a very recent work, we collected data from more than 650 participants to evaluate how prevalent misophonia is and what does it do to them, actually. Sorry, what
minutes.
Prevalence of mimicry. Yeah. So we asked questions related to the misophonia severity, types of trigger, mimic or not, and whether does the act of mimicking provide relief or not. And this is the data, basically, you see that one. So as the misophonia severity increases, the likelihood of mimicry also increases. And moreover, among all different types of sound that we looked at, it is the eating sound which are more likely to trigger the mimicking reaction. And we also asked them, okay, what does the mimicking do to you, whether it really helps you in some way? And we asked the question, mimicking the action or the sound of the triggered person provides me relief from the distress. About 9 to 10% people say we always get relief from that. And then some are like often or sometimes. So even if you just add these kind of 3 bars, you get a figure of about 50 to 60%. So 50 to 60% of people seem to be getting some sort of relief from the mimicking. So this seems to be saying that, at least the data is saying that mimicking is quite prevalent in misophonia, and it seems to provide some relief to some people and provide even sense of controls. And need to understand why it works for some and why it doesn't work for others. And I think that mimicry, as we discussed in our 2021 paper, we can also understand within the action perception framework, how we perceive the action of the other. The phenomena of mimicry can be understood within that framework, but not within the sound framework. So what I'm suggesting is, probably I'll not have much time to go into the detail of the model, but I'm just kind of proposing a model which is based on, we should understand misophonia within the social perception or cognition framework, how we understand the action of other people in the social world. So that could that could show some way to understand misophonia. So as I said, the emphasis here is on the source of the sound, not on the sound per se. It emphasizes how we perceive the action of the other people in the social world. And perception of action, as I said, it activates motor area. You can make sense of the motor area and also the mimicry. And it can also explain why maybe the anger is one of the dominating emotion in misophonia and not any other emotion, for example. So there are lots of aspects that we try to explain in our 2021 paper. So to maybe complete the picture, what I feel is that this should be the complete picture of misophonia, where the person or the source or the social context within which the sound is produced, that has to be brought in within the sound, and then we can make better sense of how misophonia related activity is represented in the brain. So what I would do is, I said I have very less time to explain all the details of the model. You can read all these papers, and I would be very happy to answer any specific question anybody has. So one paper we are just kind of writing at the moment that will highlight a social perspective on, or a social cognitive perspective on misophonia. The other 2 studies are, one of them is published, the other one is under review, and you can check that out actually. So last but not the least, I would like to thank all my colleagues in the lab, Dr. Phillip Gander, Dr. Joe Berger, who are my colleague here in the University of Iowa. Alexa is leading on the MRI, some of the fMRI project. Dr. Ester Benzaquén and Paris from UK, Newcastle University and Sunderland University, they have been helping with the mimicry data collection. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Thanks. I apologize for my slow entrance into the event. So no thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions, and I'll start us off. The first just jumps right into mimicry. Someone says, mimicking helps me cope. And I'm curious as to why. Yeah. Why does mimicking help?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. And I think we have kind of tried to answer this question in our 2020, but here is the kind of crux of the argument. Because when you are listening to the trigger sound, your trigger sound is activating your motor system. So it is almost the same motor system as if you were doing that action. So for example, if I see somebody eating or chewing, then that sound, and if I'm a misophonic person, my motor system would be highly activated by that trigger sound. And particularly that motor system, which is involved in doing my own action. So it is just like a motor drive you can think from the outside, which is activating your motor system to, well, almost do the same action as the other person is doing. But the mimicry is basically, so in a way, it kind of like this drive is saying to do this action. And you lose, okay, there's something going on which is beyond my control, and repeating something something driving my brain. I want to get a sense of control on it. So when you do your own action, when you start repeating that action, because now that action is under your control, you get a sense of control on that one. So at least you are in control of what is happening to the action. And so that basically provides a sense of relief in terms of repeating that particular action, rather than being at the mercy of the sound drive, external sound driving your action. You get a sense of control on that, and that seems to be providing a sense of relief, actually. Yeah. So that's the kind of whole argument. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And control is one area of study generally in misophonia research, and memory has also been an area of study in other research. And the next question links together mimicry, control, and memory.
Yeah.
So do you think the significance of memories of those with misophonia, and the person is referring to mimicry in general, and that the memories that and misophonia begin at around 8 years old, that those things begin to emerge at around 8, because that's the time that people tend to develop critical thinking skills, abstract thinking at this time. So, for example, one can link a negative memory and subsequent mimicry based around a family member triggering someone when they're around that time, 8 years old, and refer back to this with an overly active episodic memory. So is there a relationship between mimicry, memory, and that particular age at which it tends to develop? And then there's a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's true, but I think, as I said, I think it all kind of makes sense. You can link them, but I think if I go by just the empirical research, I think the question of how it starts, how the misophonia start, why you are maybe triggered by a particular person. We try to give some hint in our paper, for example. Maybe you are, because the mimicking phenomena is not special to misophonia, mimicking. Mimicking, we all do mimicking in social world. It's very common, right? So, for example, we try to take people's accent and kind of other things. So mimicking is almost like a universal, which kind of also even goes unconsciously, subconsciously. You try to mimic you mimic the action of the other people. So it's very common. But I think what happens in misophonia is it becomes excessive. So because obviously you are not mimicking to everybody, right? You obviously mimicking, there's some like a group relationship. Okay, if the person is belonging to your own family member or a group, you try to mimic it to more compared to the people who are belonging outside. So there's a lot of work in the mimicry, in the social mimicry literature, actually. So obviously there's a control mechanism, that kind of like top-down mechanism tells you, okay, which one to control, which one to mimic, which one not to mimic, even subconsciously. So what I feel is that mimicry being common in the social world, it is basically excessive, that top-down mechanism in misophonia that breaks down, and that top-down breakdown, the top-down, I mean that top-down control, which basically tells you, okay, now mimic or not mimic, that, in a kind of like a simple way to say that one. So that breaks down, and we provide, like in our 2017 paper, we show that the frontal part, the medial prefrontal part of the brain, basically, that probably has a role to play in that. That connectivity kind of breaks down, and then it becomes excessive, and that excessive mimicry kind of starts interfering with your current goals, because imagine, somebody driving your motor system from outside, and you are doing some attention, you are paying some attention to your work, because that drive won't allow you to concentrate on that one. So exactly. So that's there's a frontal, but now whether it is related to at the age of 8 or 14, whether that specific is involved, we know that the frontal part, develops around that age. Whether it is specifically linked to misophonia, that needs to be investigated further. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
The follow-up question, the related question, this person wondered if these processes were in any way related to the processes of PSTD, those intrusive memories, and that intrusive kind of reaction.
Not that I can think of any literature. At least I probably may not be able to say specifically whether those PSD. There is definitely a literature on misophonia being comorbid with other disorder, PSTD being one. I would say that there are lots of other things that can indirectly heighten your reaction. So say, for example, if you're anxious, if you're already anxious, and then you hear that sound, that kind of heighten your reaction. So I don't know whether PSTD would specifically, those memory would be interfering and specifically targeting misophonic reaction, or it's kind of like a more general increasing your anxiety and causing that reaction. So I think it's difficult to say that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. The next question is also related to mimicry, and then we'll move on to some other questions. But would you characterize the mimicry as compulsive? I know the paper itself does distinguish between spontaneous mimicry and more thoughtful. So this question relates to that. Would you describe mimicry generally as compulsive?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Well, now, so the thing is, for example, people who say that they get relief, after mimicking. So we kind of like ask them, okay, is it beyond your control or is it under your control? And then they said, yeah, it's under my control, but I deliberately start doing that because that provides me relief. Now, this would say probably it's not maybe compulsive because it's, well, at least they think that, okay, they are doing it deliberately. It's not kind of being driven something which is not under their control. And I think if we want to take misophonia to the action control level, it seems like you're conscious aware that, okay, you are under control of this particular, that is very, very important. Because in compulsive, actually, it seems like, they could be doing deliberate, but they can still interpret, okay, I'm doing it. So that level is possible. But at least within the data, it seems like it's not compulsive, but it seems something like the deliberate and chosen action.
Thank you. This relates, one more question related to the age of onset issue. Someone wonders, is it possible that neural pruning, which also happens around that anecdotal age of onset, might also play a role in misophonia?
Definitely, it is definitely possible. I mean, as I said, the age of onset is very, very striking at that age, but I think it needs a little bit more empirical support empirical research to support that factor. But yeah, as I said, it can't be just a coincidence. There should be something happening. But what is really happening? Which areas are pruned more? Obviously, pruning is it happens in everybody. But then why in misophonia? Whether there are some more brain parts which are targeted in pruning, that needs investigation in that. Yeah.
Thank you. Someone asks, let's see, how can I get, or we get a formal neurological diagnosis in order to get better care? And I guess I would ask you, will a formal neurological diagnosis lead to better care for people with misophonia? Should people seek this out?
We're at 10 minutes.
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question, but I think it seems like until somehow it kind of the misophonia appears in some sort of like DSM-4 in DSM, it will be very difficult to diagnose it formally, I think, because obviously still people don't recognize misophonia as anything. There's no classification of that one. So I think unless that part is taken, it will be very difficult to do a formal, diagnosis of misophonia, I think. Yeah.
So thank you for that. And I heard Chris say we have about 10 minutes. I'll let us know when we have 5 minutes left too. So there are a couple of questions about non-oral facial triggers.
Yeah.
So can you talk about why people might react to triggers that aren't oral facial? Do you have plans to conduct research in that area also?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and we are kind of aware. Non-orofacial. If our hypothesis is correct, which we posed in our 2021 paper, So it doesn't matter what organ or what the actions are, whether it's mouth-related action or, for example, keyboard typing could also, maybe the hand action could be involved. Or to what extent like a specific orofacial motor area would be involved in orofacial triggers. So I think obviously their dominant triggers are, these eating, breathing triggers, but we know that there are other triggers. And I think it will be interesting to examine how specifically the orofacial motor cortex is recruited for the orofacial trigger and other hand-related or other triggers, whether the hand-related motor cortex is triggered. But I also see that, okay, there would be some specific part of the motor cortex that would be activated, but that's not it. There will be like a more general motor cortex would also be included in the activation. So I think it's a good question we need to understand, and I think we are putting a proposal to make a distinction between the orofacial versus non-orofacial trigger, and whether the specific part of the motor cortex would be activated depending upon the action that produced the sound.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And returning to mimicry, which seems to be very popular in the questions, there are two related questions. Does your model explain why some people with miso benefit from mimicry and why others do not? And a related question would be, is mimicry related to empathy? So, for example, walking in someone's shoes, is empathy associated with mimicry and misophonia?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. Yeah. So I think the question of why, for example, it helps to some, because the thing is, it somehow we feel, again, I think the action or the motor, people who study the motor system and the action system, they kind of tell us that, okay, you just to have a sense of control, it's somehow like the action has to be performed in a particular way. But I think maybe let me just say at the beginning, it's kind of at the moment we don't know the answer why. Maybe it helps in some and why it doesn't help in the other. But as a general framework, it seems like the motor system helps in doing, taking control over that one. Now, whether, for example, some people, whether the action has to be a little bit more synchronous, or it has to be delayed, or there has to be some particular sort of, some people do the action in a particular way, or they are able to, others are not able to do that. I think this is an open question. We need to look into that one. Now, coming to the question of empathy, yes. I mean, empathy and kind of mimicry, empathy is also in some sort of like a mimicry, because empathy is, you can think of like putting in somebody else's shoes, feeling somebody else's emotion, but mimicry is like more, you can think of like a motor system only, just the motor system. You are just doing the action of the other one, but are not feeling the, emotions or of the other person. So yeah, it is at one level they are similar. And I would like to just point out my 2017 paper. Obviously, that time we didn't have the social perception framework in mind, and the structure that we got activated, hugely activated, was insula. And insula is a very much social structure. So when you are empathizing with others, for example, you're putting into somebody else's shoes empathetically, your insula is activated. And guess what, for example, the emotion-related area that we got in our 2000 was insula. So we now think that even the emotion-related area that we are seeing, they are all social brain areas. They are not like, you don't see much of like amygdala, for example. Although amygdala is also a bit of a social structure, but you can see kind of more intrinsic sound-related responses are there in the amygdala, but you don't see that one. You see very high-level structures, actually. So yes, I would say the answer is mimicry, empathy, they are related. And now we are starting a project, basically, looking at the relationship between the tendency to mimic and also the empathetic, because empathy has been measured and used in social perception research. So we just want to see how correlated they are, actually. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. And we have 4 minutes left now. So and a final question, and unless we have a few more, relates to something people talk about a lot. And it's a very specific question, but it relates to a general issue of people needing to see what's triggering them. So here's what people will like seek out a sound. They need to eyeball it in order to cope. So this is what the specific question is, and that's the general thing, is that why, if you're making a trigger sound, would someone follow you to look at you? So this person is reporting that the person with misophonia wants to make sure the person stops and also needs to see the action or the sound happening, or it feels worse. So why do you think this is?
Yeah, again, I think, I would say, well, I think one way would be to help it to contextualize, because I think once you have, for example, you are in an unknown, uncertain environment, and there are people around you, so you don't know you don't have much knowledge about the situation there. But I guess actually looking at the person that, okay, this sound is produced by this person, it helps basically to, in some sort of, contextualize the whole thing. And then, because once you have a knowledge of the source, right, where it is coming from. For example, I have been told by a few people, okay, I was sitting in my office and there was this sound that I heard, and my reaction was just terrible. I had a terrible reaction to that sound. But the moment I realized, oh, that sound was not that my colleague, which I thought was producing, but it was coming from somewhere else, and my reaction kind of cooled down. I was not, that reaction was not there. So I feel that this contextualization of the knowledge of the source probably definitely helps in putting the percept of the sound and the distance also. Yeah. So that also you can think of context is like a top-down control. Once I have a knowledge, I can basically, I can exert control on all the brain system which are increasing my heart rate or physiological reactions or otherwise. So that knowledge helps to basically put that control onto your system. Yeah.
Great. Well, and here's a question about not having that knowledge, about pre-conscious, and we have like 90 seconds. Is it fair to say that rather than being related to conscious control, this mimicry might be akin to premonitory sensory motor urge, as in tic disorders?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So in a way, you become, so this one, you have this so-called unconscious drive from this one, and then once you get a control of that one, that you become more conscious, you become more under control of that one. Yeah.
Great questions. And it's 1:54. The next event starts at 1:55. So thank you so much, Dr. Kumar. This was wonderful, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you.